Brian, what are your thoughts? Do you think this has been too rushed? You train people, work with perpetrators for more than 20 years. Is it being too rushed in your opinion?
Well, I think so. I concur with what everyone has said previously. What we're dealing with here, I think, is an attempt at some sort of global response to domestic and family violence that we feel on the surface is going to solve the problem. But the reality is it's a liberty crime, and it's a crime that needs to be addressed. Whether it has to have its own legislation in and of itself is very debatable, I think. I don't think the jury is finally come to terms with that. We have domestic violence laws now which include control in their definitions. This is in Queensland. We have strangulation laws, we have sexual assault laws, we have deprivation of liberty laws, we have torture laws and stalking laws. I think, adding another layer of legislation to what is not being addressed adequately already may in fact set us up for failure. And by failure, I'm talking about failing victims. And we've spoken about justice today. Is this going to actually provide justice for victims, or is it going to muddy the waters with the unintended consequences that have been spoken about before? Is it going to be a further avenue that perpetrators can use to further abuse their partners? I don't think we've really thought this through clearly enough, and the implications of this law. It's one thing to have the symbolic value of legislation. It's another to be able to ensure its operationalisation and its being effectively dealt with in the actual the frontline trenches where this is happening. I think the understanding that it gives us, and there is an education and an awareness around coercive control now that wasn't before, is that domestic and family violence is obviously far more than physical, and it's far more than one incident. It's a whole pattern and a dynamic and a strategy that a perpetrator uses over time. I think it's given us that realisation. But I think we also have to understand that coercive control is not anything new. It's actually all of domestic and family violence is about coercion and control.
Thelma, what's your thoughts on that? Do you think the system is in some ways broken? Can the system handle it?
Having sat on the task force in Queensland, our second report, Hear Her Voice, Report 2 examined sexual violence through the lens of women and girls' experience through the criminal justice system, both prior to entry, during the criminal justice system, and then when they came out. It is clear to me, and that 188 recommendations made by the task force, including myself, that it is a system that is not capable of adequately responding to victim survivors of domestic and family violence and sexual violence. These are not safe places. These are not trauma-informed spaces. These are spaces that, given the underlying realm of the rule of law and a defendant's right to a fair trial and other rights, preference a defendant and forget with respect the victim's place in this and what justice looks like for that victim when she finally has the courage and the strength to bring a complaint to police, to agitate for that complaint to be actioned, and then brought through the court system. It's not adequately prepared. It cannot properly respond to a victim's needs. So I would suggest, in relation to what New South Wales is doing and what we learnt from Scotland, before they implemented these laws, there was an implementation plan, which is part of the heart of what the task force recommended, what the Queensland government has now agreed to in the 85 recommendations specifically aimed at government before we introduce coercive control as a law in Queensland. You need system reform. All of those wraparound intersectors that are part of this need to be brought into this. You can't just be relying on outcomes to change, given that you've got a strengthened or bolstered police response and a court response without looking at what are the inherent deficiencies and gaps. And there are gaps here. And I think what I'd like to see with New South Wales is having a look at the broader system response here, because it's not those two components. They play a very big part in this. But if you want to stop the rate of recidivism, you actually need to get to the heart of why do people think that it is acceptable to engage in coercively controlling behaviours, which then stem into the broader domestic and family violence spectrum. And I'm looking at now in Cairns, we've had the death of a 5-year-old. And this is in a family violence context. And I look at this, I look at all of the deaths that we seem to see each week across Australia, and I wonder, what the hell are we getting wrong here?
Yeah.
This is not just about policing and the courts. This is broader, and it needs to stop, and we need to address it.
Thelma, I'm so sorry I have to interrupt because I'm being told to wrap up, but I just wanted to get to 10 seconds from Hayley, Nicole and Brian to wrap it up. So, Hayley, do you want to just give us your final words on this? And I wish we could go longer, but we can't, unfortunately.
Yeah, no worries. Look, all eyes are on New South Wales at introducing the law first, right across the country. I have to say that the first exposure draft has not got it right. It's not even close. We have until Wednesday to provide feedback, and there are fundamental problems with this draft bill. We would urge the New South Wales government to reconsider the time frame, and we are well and truly ready to work with you, alongside you, to make sure that this is an effective law with all the systems that wrap around it.
Nicole, we've got 10 seconds to get your response as well.
Well, when it comes to disabled people, it's understanding all the areas in which we and the environments in which we do encounter coercive control and abuse, and understanding that coercive control is a form of every form of domestic and family violence. It is not something that is necessarily segregated on its own. And finally, is that, criminalising alone is not something that is going to be acting as a deterrent, and that is something that has been noted overseas. And that there has to be other options around, shifting of community attitudes and looking at issues around gender inequality, and looking at how disabled people are depicted in courtrooms and how unsafe they are, and the ways in which we are spoken about as well.
Thank you. And Brian, just quickly.
I think the system isn't broken. I don't think the system has ever worked. So we need a new system, and if it's going to bring in coercive control, that has to be operationalised and defined very, very clearly. And then, of course, we have to do the education of courts and police, etc. And then what do we do with those convicted? There have to be resources available to deal with the aftermath.
Sorry to wrap it up, but we have to go to a break now. Thank you all so much for your time. And if this story has raised any concerns, you can contact the Domestic Violence Helpline on 1800 RESPECT. After the break, Cowboys coach Todd